Tonight we find ourselves on a knife-edge ridge in the Swiss Alps, the last of the day's sun-bleeding tangerine and violet across a sea of stone and cloud. The air is so thin and clear it feels less like breathing and more like sipping chilled glass. Below you, valleys plunge into deep, velvety blue shadows, and above, the first defiant stars prick the fading cobalt dome. You're standing on a worn groove in the grass and bedrock, a subtle dip no wider than your shoulders, that curves along the contour of the mountain before disappearing over the next rise. This is your starting line. This faint seam in the earth is a forgotten footpath, one of thousands that once stitched together the isolated dairy farms of the high Alps into a living, breathing network. You've left the postcard-perfect villages and the hum of cable cars far below. Here, the only sounds are the sigh of the wind through dry grasses, the distant clank of a cowbell carried on a thermal from some unseen pasture, and the steady, rhythmic crunch of your own boots on ancient gravel. You are, quite literally, on the edge of the world these communities knew. A world defined not by borders on a map, but by the grazing line, the pass that could be crossed in late summer, the spring that never ran dry. You take a step forward, and the modern world, with its Wi-Fi signals and train schedules, dissolves into a historical phantom. You are now operating on Alpine time, measured in footsteps, daylight, and the endurance of your own lungs. And let's be perfectly, dryly honest for a moment. The herders who forged this path would look at your moisture-wicking jacket and carbon fiber hiking poles and offer a slow, unimpressed blink. You are following in the footsteps of people for whom this was a commute, for whom a missed step could mean a broken leg miles from help, and for whom survival was a daily, unglamorous chore. You probably wouldn't survive a winter here, but that's okay. We're just visiting. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps these stories find their way to more curious minds like yours. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The path you're on isn't marked on any tourist brochure. It's too humble, too specific. It doesn't lead to a famous summit or a picturesque lake. Its destination is far more practical, a south-facing slope a few kilometers away where the grass is a shade greener, where a particular herd of Heron's cattle, those feisty, dark-coated fighters of the cow world, were taken to graze in the late afternoon sun of a century ago. You're not hiking for a view, you're ghosting a bovine dinner parade. Every curve in the trail is a negotiation with the mountain's stubborn anatomy. It skirts a cliff too sheer, dips into a gully where a spring once provided a watering stop, and climbs steadily but always manageably, because the cows, and the men, women, and children driving them, had to make this trip twice a day, every day, for the 5 months of the summering season, or alpage. This is the first, most widely accepted historical fact you need to grasp. These paths were not built in the way we think of construction. They were born from use. They are the accumulated result of countless identical choices made over centuries. The first to tread this way might have been a lone herder following a deer trail. The next, seeing the wisdom of that route, followed. Hooves, thousands upon thousands of them, wearing down the turf. Hobnailed boots, the medieval equivalent of rugged tread, scraping away loose scree. Each generation subtly improved the line, moving a stone here, packing gravel there, creating a switchback where the direct descent proved too muddy and treacherous. It was a form of collective, unconscious engineering. The path evolved like a riverbed, finding the path of least resistance through an unforgiving landscape. And here's a lesser-known, slightly amusing detail to ground you in that reality. Many of the most enduring features of these trails are the direct result of animal stubbornness. Cows, it turns, are creatures of profound habit. Once a lead cow decided a certain route to the milking shed was the correct one, the entire herd would follow her, day after day, creating a deeply entrenched track. Herders often found it easier to accommodate the herd's chosen path, even if it was slightly less optimal, than to fight 50 stubborn, half-ton animals. So, in a very real sense, you are now following a trail that may have been originally scouted by a particularly opinionated brown cow sometime in the 1600s. Her legacy is etched into this mountainside. As the last light fades from the highest peaks, painting them a fleeting rose gold, you reach a natural viewpoint. The path ahead splits into two faint lines, one descending sharply to the left, another contouring straight ahead. There is no signpost. Historians still argue whether these splits represent different destinations, perhaps rival farms or pastures belonging to different communes, or whether they are chronological, a newer, better route superseding an older, more dangerous one that fell into disuse. The stones aren't telling. You have to make a choice, guided by the lay of the land and the ghost of intuition. You choose the contouring path, trusting that it feels more worn. As you do, you feel the first true connection to the past, not as a museum piece, but as a participant in a silent, ongoing dialogue between human need and a mountain's will. The contouring path proves wise. It holds to a steady, gentle grade, a masterpiece of passive-aggressive negotiation with the mountain's steep pitch. You're not climbing so much as you are being persuasive, convincing the slope to let you pass with minimal fuss. Underfoot, the texture changes. The soft alpine turf gives way to a harder, packed surface, and in places, you hear a distinctive click under your boot. Looking down, you see it, not just dirt and grass, but a scattered constellation of small, sharp stones, some oddly flattened or sheared. This is the debris of millennia, but mixed within it are darker, angular fragments. You kneel, brushing away loose grit, and your fingers find not a random rock, but a piece of worked iron, thick as your thumb, rusted into a brittle sculpture. A few steps ahead, another. They are hobnails, the hard, nail-shaped studs hammered into the soles of boots by Roman legionaries, medieval merchants, and Alpine herders for nearly 2,000 years. You are walking on a sedimentary record of footsteps. Each nail represents a repair, a moment when a traveler sat by this very path, perhaps with a view identical to yours, hammering new traction into worn leather. They are the unglamorous, functional ancestors of your high-tech boot tread. The widely accepted historical fact here is that the Roman Empire, in its relentless expansion and need for military supply lines, engineered the first major, intentional road networks through the Alpine passes. But those were the grand, strategic highways for armies and imperial messengers, the Vie Publici. The path you're on is different. It's a capillary. It's where the Grand Roman Road, miles away in the valley, dissipated into 1,000 tiny filaments reaching into the high pastures. The hobnails you find are likely from a later era, from the boots of the people who used the Roman roads as a starting point before branching off into their own vertical world. These nails tell a story of adaptation. The herders and traders took the Roman concept of durable footway and made it their own. Their hobnails weren't just for grip on icy paths, they were a multi-tool. A hider could use the edge of a thick nail to scrape mud from a hoof, pry a stone from a horse's shoe, or even spark a flint in a pinch. The boots were heavy, clumsy by today's standards, and must have been agony on long descents, jamming the toes forward with every downward step. But they were armor. They turned an ankle-twisting scree slope into a manageable, if noisy, staircase. The sound of a group approaching would have been a metallic crunching chorus, a signature announcement of human arrival long before the person came into view. Now for the surprising detail that makes this concrete, or rather, iron. In certain preserved sections of these trails, particularly in soft peat or muddy areas that have since dried, archaeologists have found perfect, reverse cast impressions of these hobnailed boots. It's one thing to find the nail, it's another to find its ghost. These impressions reveal not just the wear pattern, which side of the sole the herder wore down first, suggesting a habitual lean or old injury, but sometimes even the stitching pattern of the long rotted leather upper. In one famous case from a site near the Simplon Pass, such an impression clearly showed a patch, a piece of leather fixed over a hole in the boot's instep. The traveler had been walking on a repair. You can't help but sympathize with the blister that must have caused a personal discomfort fossilized in mud for centuries. As you stand up, your eyes now tuned to look for these metallic crumbs, the scale of the endeavor dawns on you. This wasn't a single, heroic act of trailblazing. It was a slow, generational accretion of necessity. The first to break snow in a late spring, testing the stability of a slope. The next, seeing that path, improving it by rolling a troublesome boulder aside. A child, tasked with driving a few cows to a new patch of clover, taking a shortcut that later became the main route. Historians still argue whether the network was primarily shaped by the demands of the cattle, always seeking the best grass with blind, instinctual efficiency, or by the conscious, strategic decisions of the herders managing them. Was the path an extension of bovine desire, or human design? The truth, much like the path itself, probably wins somewhere in between, a partnership of stomach and brain, each guiding the other. You pocket a single hobnail, a tiny, cold weight of history. The light is almost gone now, the world reduced to monochrome blues and blacks. The path, however, remains faintly visible, a slightly darker line against the dark ground. It has a glow about it, a memory of the day's sun held in the packed earth. You follow it by feel as much as by sight, your boots finding the groove. You listen for the change in sound from the scrunch of loose scree to the solid thump of the packed track. You are learning the grammar of the path. And with every step, the metallic ghosts of 10,000 earlier journeys click softly beneath you, a whispered conversation in iron about wear, repair, and the relentless need to keep moving. In the deep indigo twilight, the path becomes a sensory experience more than a visual one. You feel its course through the soles of your feet, a subtle camber telling you to lean into the slope. You hear it in the absence of sound where your foot falls on solid, packed earth versus the loose scatter of stones just an inch to the left. And as the last silhouette of the peaks dissolves into the star-flecked sky, you see a new kind of guide, a small, deliberate pile of stones, a cairn, rising from the path's edge like a silent sentinel. It's not grand. It's maybe knee-high, a handful of flat rocks stacked with a pragmatic balance. But in this vast, featureless dark, it is as welcome and deliberate as a street lamp. This is how you navigate now. You are reading a map made of stone and story. This is the widely accepted historical fact of Alpine wayfinding. In the absence of signposts and before the age of printed maps, communities relied on a living lexicon of natural and built markers. Cairns, known as Steinmänner or Montjoys, were the most common. Built at points where the path might be ambiguous, a fork, a broad plateau, a section easily obscured by snow, they were maintained communally. Passing herders would add a stone, both as a ritual of passage and as practical maintenance, repairing the marker against wind and weather. The cairn you just passed wasn't built once. It has been rebuilt, stone by added stone, for centuries. It's a collective "I was here" that also means this is the way. But the stone markers were only part of the language. As your eyes adjust, you might spot a faint, weathered dash of paint on a rock face, ochre yellow or a chalky white. These are the faded echoes of later waymarks, but the original system was far more organic. Blazes were cut into the bark of certain trees at eye level. Distinctive, lone-standing boulders were given names: the sleeping monk, the cow's head, the shepherd's tooth. A peculiar twist in a creek, a lightning-blasted pine, a spring that bubbled in a specific rhythm, all were waypoints in an oral map. Herders didn't memorize distances in kilometers, they memorized sequences of stories. The journey to the high pasture wasn't a list of tones. It was a narrative. Walk to the stone that looks like your grandfather's face, then follow the water's song until you see the larch tree that holds the hawk's nest, then head for the saddle where the wind always whistles. You are now inside that narrative, a character moving between its paragraphs. Here's the lesser-known, charmingly pragmatic detail. One of the most reliable markers was also one of the most ephemeral, manure. In a practice that would make a modern hiking purist grimace, the condition and location of animal droppings were critical navigational aids. A fresh, moist pile on the path meant the herd was likely just ahead, confirming you were on the correct route to an active pasture. Older, dried droppings at a crossroads might indicate a route no longer in use that season. The type of manure told you what animals had passed: dense cow pats, drier sheep pellets, or the distinctive droppings of pack mules. It was a real-time, biodegradable traffic report. In thick fog or a whiteout blizzard, a hiker might literally feel his way forward with a staff, probing for the textured evidence of the path's recent use. It was navigation by ecology, a constant dialogue with the signs of life that shared the trail. You reach a point where the path skirts a particularly treacherous section of loose slate. The cairn here is substantial, a small tower. Just beyond it, etched into a more stable slab of bedrock, are a series of shallow grooves, worn not by tools but by countless generations of rope. This is a belay point. Here, on market days or during the autumn descent, herders would secure ropes to help lower heavily laden animals or sledges down the slippery incline. The grooves are a record of immense, controlled friction. But which communities maintained this spot? Historians still argue whether these critical infrastructure points were maintained by individual farming families, by the collective will of an entire Alpine commune, or through formal agreements, an early form of public works contract, between valleys. The depth of the grooves suggests immense, shared effort, but the historical records, often just bills for rope or complaints about neighbors not contributing labor, are fragmentary. The stone holds the evidence of cooperation, but the precise human agreements behind it have frayed with time. Guided by the canes and the memory in your feet, you crest a small rise. Below, in a fold of the mountain so dark it seems like a pool of ink, you see a single, tiny, flickering point of orange light. It's too steady to be a star. It's firelight, seen through a small window. It is your destination, a destination that has existed for centuries precisely because this path led to it. The map of stone and story has brought you home, not to your home, but to the home this path was built to serve. The silent dialogue of the markers ends here, at the threshold of human warmth. You take a final look back at the cairn silhouetted against the starry sky, a period in the mountain's sentence, and begin your descent toward the glow. The orange glow resolves into a square of warm, smoky light emanating from a small, thick-paned window. The structure it belongs to is a stubborn, hunched silhouette against the mountainside, built not to impress but to endure. This is a mazet or sen hut, an alpine dairy hut. As you approach, the details emerge in the periphery of the window's light. Walls of rough-hewn, darkened timber, heavy stone slabs on the roof weighed down by more stones, and a low, deeply overhanging eave designed to shrug off avalanches like an annoyed shoulder. It smells profoundly of old wood smoke, cured meat, damp wool, and the sharp, sour-sweet tang of fermenting milk. You don't knock. In the old way, you simply push the heavy wooden door, its iron hinges groaning a low protest, and step inside. The heat hits you first, a thick, living warmth radiating from a central stone hearth where a log smolders. The light is dynamic, dancing from the fire and a single kerosene lamp, throwing gigantic, wavering shadows of copper pots and suspended cheeses up into the rafters, which are blackened by decades of smoke. This is not a quaint cottage. It's a factory, a shelter, and a fortress, all in one low-ceilinged, single room. The widely accepted historical fact is that these huts were the essential nodes of the summering economy. From late spring to early autumn, the herder, the sen, would live here alone or with an apprentice, processing the milk of the herd into butter and cheese, primarily the formidable wheel of Alpcase or Alpine cheese. This was where the raw bounty of the pasture was transformed into a durable, transportable, valuable commodity. But to see it only as a cheese factory is to miss its true genius. This hut is a museum of vertical logistics. Every item in here was carried up on someone's back or on a mule, so nothing is wasted or superfluous. The sleeping pallet in the corner is a wooden platform stacked with hay and coarse wool blankets. The shelves are carved directly into the log wall, holding a few precious personal items: a pipe, a worn Bible, a carved spoon. The centerpiece is the vast copper cheese-making vat, gleaming dully in the firelight, set permanently into a stone base over what was once a dedicated fire pit. But look closer. The walls are lined with hooks holding an array of tools whose purposes you can only guess at. Curved knives for cutting curds, huge wooden paddles for stirring, intricate molds for butter. It's a surgeon's toolkit for milk. And everywhere, suspended from the ceiling like stalactites in a cave, are the cheeses themselves, aging in the cool, smoke-infused air, their rinds developing a complex patina of mountain microbiology. Here's the surprising, slightly absurd detail that brings the sen's isolation into focus. His most constant companion, besides the cows, was often a large wheel of cheese. Not just any cheese, but a specific, previous season's wheel. It served as his chair, his table, his pillow. The massive, dense disc, which could weigh over 80 pounds, was a perfect, multifunctional piece of furniture. It didn't rot, it just continued to mature, absorbing the soot, sweat, and stories of the hut. By the end of the season, the side that had been sat upon would be flattened, its rind polished to a shine. When it was finally sent down to the valley to be sold, it carried with it the literal imprint of the herder's solitude. Consumers in Beaune or Milan were, in a very tangible way, eating the chair of an Alpine herder. It's a level of product terroir that modern marketing could never invent. You sit on a rough-hewn stool by the fire, the centuries of condensed smoke making the air taste almost solid. The sen, a figure of few words, his face lined like the topography outside, offers you a chunk of dark bread and a slice of this year's cheese, sharp and crystalline. As you eat, you consider the profound self-reliance of this place. The herder was veterinarian, meteorologist, carpenter, firefighter, and master cheesemaker. But was he truly alone? Historians still argue whether the sen hut was a place of absolute isolation or a secret hub of a scattered community. Some evidence, like records of specific feast days where multiple herders would gather, or the discovery of simple gaming pieces carved from bone, suggests a social network flickering between the high pastures. Other scholars point to diaries filled with crushing loneliness and a deep, almost mystical identification with the animals and the weather. The truth likely oscillated like the mountain winds, long stretches of profound silence punctuated by vital, intense moments of human contact when paths converged. The hut was a sanctuary designed for solitude, but its door, you just proved, was never locked to a traveler on the path. The fire pops, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney hole. Outside, the wind has picked up, moaning under the eaves. But in here, in this wooden capsule buried in the mountain's flank, the world is held at bay. The hut isn't just a building, it's a thermodynamic miracle, a bubble of captured warmth and culture in a cold, indifferent landscape. It exists solely because the paths led to it, and the paths exist because huts like this needed to be reached. You finish the cheese, its sharpness lingering on your tongue, a direct taste of the pasture just outside the door, processed by fire, copper, and timeless patience. The journey isn't paused here, it is, for a night, absorbed. The deep, resonant clang of a large cowbell shatters the pre-dawn silence, not from outside, but from within the hut. The sun is already moving in the near dark, the embers of the fire casting just enough light to see him lift the heavy treacle from its hook. This isn't the gentle tinkle of a tourist souvenir. It's a serious instrument, a wooden bell strapped to leather, its sound deep, percussive, and urgent. He opens the door to a world still submerged in indigo and steps out, the bell's call rolling out over the sleeping slopes. This is the alarm clock of the Alps, and you are now part of the ancient, precise clockwork of transhumance. You follow him out into the biting cold. The sky is just beginning to bleach at the eastern edges, revealing the herd scattered across the nearby slope like dark boulders. At the sound of the bell, a miraculous thing happens. The boulders stir, rise, and begin to flow. They are not cattle as you imagine them, docile, slow, but a disciplined, if shaggy, militia. They know this sound means movement, and they know their places. This is the daily and seasonal heartbeat of the mountain, the orchestrated movement of life to where the grass is. The widely accepted historical fact of transhumance is that it is a form of vertical pastoralism, a seasonal migration between lowland winter stables and high alpine summer pastures. But to witness it, even in this small dawn ritual, is to see it for what it truly is, a complex, living logistics operation honed over 1,000 years. Every step is purposeful, every animal has a role, and the entire economy of the region literally walks up and down these paths. The Sen is no longer just a cheesemaker. He is a conductor. He uses specific calls, whistles, and the strategic placement of his body and staff to guide the lead cows, the experienced matriarchs who know the paths better than any human, onto the correct trail. The younger animals fall in line, and the herd strings out along the path you arrived on, a slow, purposeful river of muscle, hide, and breath steaming in the cold air. The sound is immense. The rhythmic thud of hooves on packed earth, the clanking of neck bells, the occasional low moo, the snorts of exertion on the steeper bits. You fall in behind, becoming part of the procession. You are no longer a solitary hiker. You are embedded in the machinery of survival. Now for the lesser-known, physically demanding detail. The most critical and brutal movements weren't these daily dawn dances. They were the two great seasonal migrations, the Alpurfahrt in June and the Alpabfahrt in September. For these, the entire community mobilized. Cows were decorated with elaborate headdresses of flowers and pine branches, and their best bells were polished to a shine, a celebration masking sheer, grueling effort. The path you're on now, manageable for a single herd, would be a chaotic, muddy, noisy bottleneck during the Alpfahrt. Picture it, dozens of herds from different valleys converging on higher ground, a slow-motion bovine traffic jam at 2,000 meters. Herders, their families, and hired hands would be everywhere, shouting, whistling, pushing, and cajoling. The weaker or younger animals, struggling with the altitude and distance, had to be helped, sometimes carried on sledges or supported by men walking alongside. It was a marathon of mud, manure, and magnificent effort, a community physically lifting its livelihood up the mountain. As you walk with the ghost of that greater migration in mind, you see the evidence in the path itself. In places, it widens dramatically into a scar on the mountainside, a result of centuries of herds spreading out to avoid congestion. In others, you pass stone retaining walls, kumauan, built specifically to prevent the herds from spilling over a cliff edge during these mass movements. But who had the right of way when two herds met on a narrow traverse? Historians still argue whether there were formal, written rules of the path or an unwritten code based on seniority, the prestige of the herd, or simple, tense negotiation between herders. Some commune archives mention fines for causing a blockage or for animals from a higher pasture spoiling the grass of a lower one before its owners had moved their herd through. It suggests a delicate, often contested diplomacy of hooves, where a misstep could lead to a feud that echoed in the valley courts for years. The path was a shared resource, but its use was a constant, high-stakes ballet. The sun finally crests the ridge, flooding the high bowl with golden light. The herd, now spread across a fresh, dew-drenched pasture, lowers its heads to graze with a collective sigh of contentment. The Sen has led them to their breakfast table. His work, and yours as an observer, is done for this movement. You stand at the edge of the pasture, watching the animals transform sunlight and grass into milk, the first step in a chain that will become food, wealth, and culture. The clockwork has ticked. The mountain's daily heartbeat, the ascent, the grazing, the descent, the milking, is underway. You feel the immense, rhythmic weight of it, a cycle as reliable as the seasons and as fragile as the weather on the pass ahead. You leave the herd to their feast, the sound of their tearing grass and low bells the only music that matters here, and you continue on the path, which now seems less like a trail and more like the main artery of a slow, patient, living clock. Leaving the pastoral symphony behind, the path takes a decisive turn. It narrows, becomes more engineered, and you notice something new underfoot. In places, the bedrock has been deliberately chiseled to create a smooth, graded surface. The casual, organic groove of the cattle track has been replaced by something more intentional. You've joined a Sormweg, a pack trail. This is the freight network of the Alps, the ductwork through which everything that wasn't made on the mountain had to flow. As you walk, you can almost hear the ghostly jingle of different bells, not the deep clonk of the cow, but the sharper, brassier ting of the mule and the heavy, dull thud of the cargo it carried. The widely accepted historical fact is that before tunnels and high-altitude railways, these pack trails were the absolute lifelines of Alpine communities. Salt from the mines of Hallstatt or Bex, dried fish from Lake Geneva, Italian silk and spices from the south, glassware, tools, iron for nails and shoes, wine, grain for bread when the local crop failed, all of it moved on the backs of sure-footed mules and their equally sure-footed handlers, the Sorma. They were the UPS drivers of the medieval and early modern world, but their route involved 1,000-meter ascents, blizzards in July, and bandits who thought a train of silk was a better prize than a herd of cattle. The path you're on isn't just a way to get milk down, it's the way the outside world got in. The design is telling. It's wider than a herding path but still intimate, often carved into cliff faces or supported by dry stone walls on the downhill side. You'll notice regular, flat pullouts every few hundred meters. These were not scenic viewpoints. They were passing places, crucial for when two trains of pack animals met on a ledge no wider than a sofa. The protocol was intricate and unyielding. The downhill train, being more stable, had the right of way. The uphill train would have to back their animals, often blindfolded to prevent panic, into one of these niches. Imagine the shouted negotiations, the braying of confused mules, the precarious shuffling of hooves over a void, all while several tons of valuable salt hung in the balance. It was a high-stakes, slow-motion dance performed with living, stubborn cargo. Here's a surprising and slightly amusing detail about these unsung heroes of logistics. The Sorma were notorious gossips and newsmongers. In an age before newspapers or radio, the pack driver was the internet. He carried letters, verbal messages, rumors of war, news of market prices, and scandal from valley to valley. A Sorma arriving at a remote inn was an event. In exchange for a hot meal and a spot by the fire, he was expected to provide a full report on the state of the world beyond the mountains. His information could dictate when a farmer sold his cheese, whether a young man left to seek work, or if a community needed to prepare for conscription. He was both respected and treated with a degree of suspicion, a walking, talking algorithm of information, some of it vital, some of it pure nonsense. His personal reliability directly influenced the reliability of his news, making the reputation of a Sorma his most valuable asset, next to his mules. You round a bend and find one of the trail's more dramatic features, a short, narrow cleft in the rock, a natural gateway that has been widened just enough for a loaded mule to squeeze through. The walls are polished smooth, shiny as patent leather, from thousands of packs scraping against the stone over centuries. It's a record of passage written in abrasion. But what was the social status of the men who did this grinding, vital work? Historians still argue whether the Sorma were independent entrepreneurs, the truckers of their day, or were they more like feudal tenants, bound to provide transport as a duty to their lord? Records show both. Some were small business owners, owning a string of mules and hiring out their services. Others were farmers required by the lease on their land to provide a certain number of days of pack service per year, moving their lord's wine or timber. It created a complex class system on the trail, where a well-off, independent carrier with fine mules might look down on a peasant fulfilling his annual obligation, even as they both faced the same cliff edge. The path begins a steep descent, and you instinctively brace your knees. For the Sorma, this was the most dangerous part. A laden animal going downhill had its center of gravity shifted perilously forward. They often used special braking techniques, tying a log behind the last mule to drag and slow the train, or using a rope harness to hold back the lead animal. The skill was immense, the margins for error non-existent. Walking in their footsteps now, you feel a new respect for the sheer mundane bravery of it. This wasn't exploration or conquest, it was a Tuesday. It was about getting the salt to the dairy so the cheese could be preserved, so the community could survive the winter. The forgotten footpath is no longer just a line on a map. It is a conveyor belt of necessity, polished smooth by sacks of grain, barrels of wine, and the weary, gossip-laden shoulders of the men who kept the high world connected to the low. The pack trail spits you out at the edge of a high, flat pasture, but your destination isn't the grass. It's a low, stone building half buried in the hillside, with a heavy, locked wooden door. This is the spiker, the communal storehouse. The sen from the hut is there, along with a few other men from invisible neighboring pastures. They are conducting business, but no money changes hands. Instead, they are trading cheese, wheels and blocks of varying sizes, colors, and ages. One man hands over 2 small, pungent wheels of a soft cheese. In return, he receives a quarter of a massive wheel of hard, aged Alp case. They nod, the deal done. You have just witnessed the secret, self-contained economy of milk and time, an economy where the bank is a hillside vault and the currency ripens on the ceiling. The widely accepted historical fact is that the extreme isolation of the summer pastures necessitated a barter economy. With villages days away and cash scarce, cheese became money. Its value was intrinsic, nutritional, caloric, stable, it aged well, and divisible, you could cut a wheel into wedges. But this wasn't chaotic swapping. It was a sophisticated system. Different cheeses represented different denominations. A fresh, moist Zyger or cottage cheese was small change, consumed quickly. A medium-aged raclette cheese was a mid-range note. The large, hard wheels of Sprins or Bergkäse, aged for 2 years or more, were the gold reserves, durable, transportable, and accepted across regional borders. This cheese currency funded everything from the Haider's winter supplies to a daughter's dowry. The spiker, often built in a strategically accessible location like this one, was the fortress where this edible wealth was secured. Inside, if you were allowed, you'd see the system's complexity. Cheeses from different huts, even different valleys, were stored separately, each marked with the distinctive brand of its maker. A simple cross, a circle, a set of initials burned into the rind. This was both a quality guarantee and a form of banking signature. The Sen didn't just make cheese. He was a central banker managing an inflation-proof portfolio. He had to judge when to spend a young cheese on immediate needs like new rope or a repaired pot, and when to invest by letting a wheel age into greater value. The entire Alpine summer was an exercise in deferred gratification, turning daily milk into future security. Now for the delightful, lesser-known detail that adds a layer of human ingenuity. Some of these cheeses weren't just food or money. They were time capsules and communication devices. Herders would sometimes press small, flat objects into the curd of a cheese destined for long aging. A coin from a particular year, a carved token, even a written note on birch bark. When the cheese was finally cracked open years later, perhaps at a wedding or a funeral in the valley, the object would be revealed, a hidden message from the past. A cheese could commemorate a birth, a death, or a particularly good summer. In a very real sense, they were encoding history and sentiment into their primary product. You weren't just eating calories, you were consuming a story, sealed in fat and salt. But who governed this edible economy? Who decided the exchange rate between a wheel of butter and a wedge of hard cheese? Historians still argue whether these values were strictly regulated by the village councils or the powerful cheesemaker guilds in the valleys, or whether they were set by a more fluid, consensus-based market rate at seasonal meetings like the one you just witnessed. Evidence points to both. Guilds set broad quality standards that influenced value, but the final barter on the high pasture often came down to factors no guild could control: the reputation of that specific sen, the perceived quality of that summer's grass on his slope, and the immediate needs of the traders. Was it a dry year, making salt, for preservation, more valuable? Was someone's daughter getting married, creating a sudden need for a lot of cash cheese for a feast? The negotiations were a subtle blend of economics, meteorology, and social standing, all conducted with calloused hands on rinds of edible gold. You leave the men to their quiet haggling. The transaction, silent and efficient, feels more profound than any stock exchange. It is an economy built not on abstraction, but on tangible, crafted substance. It is an economy that respects time, because time literally made the product more valuable. As you walk away, the image stays with you: wealth that can be smelled, touched, and, ultimately, eaten. An entire financial system that would mold, not melt, in a crisis. The forgotten footpath led you here, to this stone vault, where the mountain's bounty was quietly, efficiently, and deliciously converted into the foundation of a life. The path descends from the high pastures into a tighter, steeper valley, where the roar of a glacial river begins to fill the air. The cairns here are less frequent, but you see a new marker, a simple, rough-hewn wooden cross nailed to a lightning-blasted larch tree. It's not ornate. It looks functional, like a tool. This is the territory of the Bergprediger, the mountain missionary. Your journey now intersects with one of faith, but not the grand, cathedral kind. This is faith on foot, carried in a worn satchel alongside bread, cheese, and a vial of holy oil, traveling the same forgotten paths to reach souls as isolated as the dairy huts. The widely accepted historical fact is that after the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the remote Alpine valleys became a patchwork of confessions: Catholic, Protestant, and stubborn pockets of older folk belief. The state churches in the distant towns sent out itinerant preachers to minister to these far-flung flocks. But these men, and occasionally women, were a different breed from parish priests. They were spiritual psalmer, carrying the word of God as another essential, if intangible, supply. Their parish was not a village square, but a circuit of huts and hamlets connected only by trails like this one. A Sunday service might be held on a tree stump, with a herd of cows as the congregation and an avalanche chute as the aisle. Imagine the scene as you approach a solitary hut at the end of a spur trail. The missionary arrives, dusty and wind-burnt. The Haydar's family, if he has one with him, gathers. The service is held in the main room, the copper cheese vat serving as an altar. The sermon would be short, practical, and woven with metaphors the listeners understood. The shepherd and his flock, the leaven in the dough, the foundation built on rock versus shifting scree. He would baptize newborns with water from the spring, perform marriages, hear confessions, and offer last rites to the dying. In return, he'd receive a night's shelter, a meal, and perhaps a small wedge of cheese for his journey. A spiritual barter not unlike the one you just witnessed at the Spiker. Here's the surprising, syncretic detail that highlights the pragmatism of this high-altitude faith. These missionaries were often de facto doctors and magicians. Their satchels contained not just Bibles and crucifixes, but medicinal herbs, amulets, and handwritten prayers meant to be worn as protective charms against the Alpdruck, nightmares thought to be caused by mountain spirits, or to ensure a healthy calving season. They walked a fine line between stamping out pagan superstition and co-opting it to make their message stick. A spring once sacred to a local spirit might be rededicated to a saint, its waters still considered potent, but now for healing in the name of Christ. The missionary had to be a theologian, a psychologist, and a folklorist, blending doctrine with the deep, animistic whispers of the mountain itself. His success was measured not in theological purity, but in whether the herders felt he understood their world well enough to speak for their souls. As you pass the wooden cross, you notice small, faded ribbons tied to its arms, offerings from travelers, a practice with pre-Christian roots. This raises a quiet, persistent scholarly question. Historians still argue whether these missionaries were ultimately agents of cultural unification, slowly imposing valley orthodoxy on the mountain periphery, or whether they themselves were transformed by the landscape and its people, becoming carriers of a unique, hybrid Alpine Christianity that was more flexible and oath-bound than the faith of the lowlands. Did the path change the message as much as the messenger carried it? The sermons that have survived are simple, but the personal diaries of some missionaries reveal a crisis of faith born of the immense silence and solitude, a feeling that God on the high pass was a different, wilder entity than God in the walled town. The path didn't just lead to the faithful, it shaped the nature of their faith. The river's roar grows louder, a constant reminder of the raw, untamed power that surrounded these isolated lives. The missionary's path was arguably the most lonely of all. The Sorma had his mules for company, the Haida his cows. The missionary often walked alone, with only his thoughts and the daunting task of bringing comfort to the edge of the world. His legacy is not in grand churches, but in these fading wooden crosses, in the saints' names given to fearsome cliffs, and in the stories that merged biblical parables with tales of avalanches and benevolent spirits of the herd. He walked the same stones, but carried a different kind of weight, the hope of salvation, traded for hospitality on the forgotten footpaths between heaven and earth. The river's roar becomes a physical presence, a mist hanging in the air, as the path ducks into a deep, shadowed gorge. The engineering here is more aggressive, blasted rock, stout log bridges lashed together with withes, and the path itself becoming a narrow ledge secured by iron rods driven into the cliff face. The cairns are gone. In their place, you see subtle, man-made recesses in the rock, perfect for a foot or a handhold, but also for bracing a body against return fire. The air of quiet pastoralism has vanished. You have entered a choke point. This section of the forgotten footpath has another, darker memory. It was a path of war and contraband. The widely accepted historical fact is that every pass, every usable route through the mountains, was a potential military corridor. From the Romans to Napoleon, armies dreamed of squeezing their cannons and columns through these natural gutters. But for the local people, war was less about grand armies and more about survival, smuggling, and resistance. When the great powers clashed, often far away in the lowlands, their conflict seeped into the high valleys in the form of requisitions, conscription, and blockades. Suddenly, the path Yuan, known only to herders and Sorma, became a strategic asset. It was a way to move men, messages, and essential goods away from the control of whatever army currently claimed the valley floor. Walking this ledge, you feel the shift. The openness of the pasture is replaced by a sense of constriction and watchfulness. This was a place where you moved at night, where a misstep meant a plunge into the thunderous water below, and where the sound of an unfamiliar boot scrape could be a death sentence. The path is a secret in plain sight, visible only to those who know how to look. During the Swiss struggle for independence, particularly in the medieval period, such paths allowed the fiercely independent cantons of Ui, Wyz, and Unterwalden to communicate and coordinate away from the eyes of Habsburg bailiffs. They were the original encrypted network. Now for the lesser-known, gritty detail that defines this era. The most common contraband wasn't silk or spice, but salt and men. Salt, a state monopoly, was heavily taxed. Smuggling it on these paths was an act of economic rebellion, a way to keep vital food preservation in local hands without filling a foreign lord's coffers. But the other cargo was human, young men fleeing conscription into foreign armies. The path became an underground railroad for deserters. Guides, often former Sorma or herders paid in cheese or coin, would lead these terrified young men on moonless nights over passes they'd never known existed, from one neutral valley to another, or into Italy. The penalty for being caught was execution, but the penalty for refusing conscription could be the burning of your family's farm. The path offered a third option: disappearance into the geography itself. Who were these guides? Were they heroic resistors or opportunistic profiteers? Historians still argue whether this clandestine use of the paths was organized by patriotic secret societies or was simply a freelance service offered by canny locals. Some village records show fines for aiding deserters, suggesting it was a known, if punishable, trade. Other accounts romanticize the guides as freedom fighters. The messy truth likely involved both, a mix of ideology, community protection, and hard cash. The path didn't care about motive, it only provided the possibility of evasion. Its value flipped from economic to political, from sustaining life to protecting it from the powers that sought to consume it. You cross one of the lock bridges, its timbers old and spongy underfoot, and enter a small cave-like overhang on the other side. On the wall, shielded from the weather, you can just make out faint charcoal markings, dates, initials, and crude tallies. A ledger of passages, perhaps. Or a record of successful runs. It's a ghostly guest book for a hotel of desperation and defiance. The river's roar here is deafening, perfect for masking the sound of a whispered password or a slipped load. This isn't the peaceful, cyclic time of transhumance. This is history's emergency exit, used in moments of acute danger. The forgotten footpath, in these moments, was remembered with life or death urgency. It was a crack in the authority of empires, a thread of local knowledge that could unravel an army's control, one secret step at a time. Emerging from the clamorous gorge, the world opens up again onto a vast, boulder-strewn slope beneath a sheer rock face. The path here is almost invisible, a suggestion of passage between car-sized glacial erratics. To find your way, you would be utterly lost without a guide. And that is precisely the point. You have entered the domain of the Bergführer, the mountain guide. But not the modern, certified professional with a radio. This is the original, indigenous guide, a person for whom this terrain was not a playground but a pantry, a highway, and a home. Their expertise wasn't a service industry, it was the bedrock of community survival, now pressed into the service of outsiders. The widely accepted historical fact is that as the Romantic era dawned in the late 18th and 19th centuries, a new kind of traveler arrived in the Alps: the scientist, the artist, and later, the tourist. They didn't want cheese or salt. They wanted data, sublime vistas, and conquest. They looked at the peaks and saw objects of study and beauty. The locals looked at the same peaks and saw weather signs, grazing potential, and routes to a neighboring valley. A profound cultural mismatch was about to be bridged, and the bridge was the local guide. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, became the essential interpreters between the flatlander's ambition and the mountain's reality. You try to pick a route across the boulder field. Each granite giant looks identical, and the gaps between them are a maze. A local guide, born in a shadow of this cliff, would move through here not by sight but by a kind of embodied memory. He knew which rock was stable and which wobbled treacherously. He knew that a certain moss pattern on the north side of a boulder indicated a seep that would be icy in the morning shade. He could read the weather not from a barometer, but from the way clouds clung to a specific pinnacle, or the sound the wind made in a particular couloir. For him, the mountain was a living, breathing entity with moods and intentions. For the visiting geologist clinging to his hammer, it was a specimen. The guide's job was to translate the mountain's language into terms the visitor could understand, or more importantly, obey. Here's the surprising, counterintuitive detail about these early guides. Their most valuable tool was often restraint, not daring. The celebrated tales are of first ascents: the guide Jacob and the scientist Horace Benedict de Saussure conquering Mont Blanc in 1787. But the daily, unrecorded work was saying no. It was looking at a wealthy English lord eager to bag a peak and calmly stating that the snow bridge over the crevasse was rotten, that the afternoon thunderheads were building too quickly, that today was not the day. This required immense social courage. These guides were often poor farmers or herders supplementing their income, while their clients were aristocrats and intellectuals used to being obeyed. The guide's authority came not from social rank, but from a knowledge so deep it was unassailable. His word was law because the mountain would enforce it. As you clumsily navigate the boulder field, you think about that relationship. Historians still argue whether the guiding dynamic was one of mutual respect or a subtle form of colonial exploitation. Did the scientist truly value the guide's intimate knowledge, or did he see him as a useful pack animal with superior route-finding instincts? Some travelogues praise the guide's noble simplicity and instinctual skill, language that patronizes as much as it compliments. Other records, like guide pay ledgers, show they could command high fees and were savvy negotiators, aware of their unique, irreplaceable value. The truth likely sat on a spectrum, varying with each pair of men. But the path under your feet was the constant. It was the guide's library, his university, his office. He wasn't leading the visitor on a path, he was sharing a fragment of his world's logic, using the forgotten footpath as his textbook. You finally clear the boulder field, thanks more to luck than skill, and find a clear trail again. Looking back, you see the complexity you just crossed is, to a trained eye, a direct line. The guide saw the path through the chaos. In an age before topographic maps, he was the map. He carried in his muscles and memories the safe sequence of moves across terrain that appeared impassable. With the coming of tourism, his profound, practical intimacy with these slopes became a commodity. The forgotten footpaths were the first curricula for a new profession, one that would eventually lead to climbing gyms and guided Everest expeditions. But it started here, with a herder pointing to a seeming wall of rock and saying, "We go this way," and then proving, step by effortless step, that he was right. The clear trail doesn't last. It leads to a high pass, a windswept saddle between two majestic peaks, and then it simply frays, like a rope reaching its end. On the other side of the pass, instead of continuing as a defined path, It dissipates into a faint, overgrown scratch that disappears under an advancing wall of young pines. You've reached a temporal frontier. This is where the 19th century arrived like a train in a quiet village, and the forgotten footpath began its great forgetting. The view from the pass is a lecture in geography. Far below, snaking through the valley you left days ago, is a thin, precise line of steel, a railway. Parallel to it, a dusty ribbon of road carries the distant, insect-like buzz of automobile engines. You are standing on the past, looking down at the future that made it obsolete. The widely accepted historical fact is that the twin inventions of the railroad and the modern, engineered road shattered the Alpine world's dependency on its footpaths. The Gotthard Railway Tunnel, completed in 1882, is the iconic symbol of this change. Suddenly, what took a Sommer days of perilous travel with a mule train could be accomplished by a freight car in hours, with no risk of avalanche or bandits. The paths that had been the arteries of an entire culture became, almost overnight, capillaries that no longer connected to a beating heart. Salt, cheese, people, news, it all flowed to the railheads now. The intricate, decentralized network of trails was bypassed by a few efficient, centralized lines of steel. The economy of the mountain flipped from vertical to horizontal. You push into the young forest that has reclaimed the path. The trees are perhaps a century old, their roots cracking the old, packed earth, their needles creating a soft, silent carpet that muffles all sound. This is the forest of forgetting. It's not a malevolent force, just nature's efficient recycling program. Where you can find the path, it's a tunnel of green, branches scraping your shoulders. In other sections, you lose it completely, forced to guess its direction based on the slight, unnatural dip in the forest floor. The spiker is now a ruin, its roof caved in. The sen hut you stayed in might still stand, but likely as a romantic holiday rental for city dwellers, its copper vat a decorative flower pot. The path's purpose has been amputated. Now for the poignant, lesser-known detail of this transition. The final generation of Sommer and herders often became the first generation of railroad laborers and tunnel diggers. The very men who knew the old paths were the ones hired to blast the new ones through the rock. Their expertise in reading stone and weather was redirected from navigation to construction. It was a brutal, ironic transition. The intimate knowledge of the mountain surface was used to pierce its heart. Many died in the brutal working conditions of the tunnel projects, a fate arguably more industrialized and anonymous than any fall on a high pass. Others found work as station porters or in the tourist hotels that sprang up near the new rail stops, trading their self-reliance for a weekly wage. The culture of the path didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. It was slowly converted, its human energy siphoned into the new infrastructure that made it redundant. Standing in the silent, encroaching pine forest, a key question arises. Historians still argue whether this was an inevitable, progressive modernization or a profound, catastrophic cultural rupture. Was it simply progress that the dangerous, slow path was replaced by the safe, fast train? Or did something irreplaceable, a whole way of being, a somatic knowledge of place, a decentralized model of living, get lost in the trade? The debate isn't academic. It echoes in modern Alpine communities torn between the economic necessity of tourism and the desire to preserve a distinct identity. The railroad brought wealth and connection, but it also turned once isolated valleys into day-trip destinations, homogenizing culture. The forgotten footpath is a casualty of that exchange, a symbol of a world that was connected in a slower, harder, more intimate way. You fight your way out of the pines and back onto open slope. The path is clear again, but it feels different. You are no longer following a living route, you are an archaeologist tracing a ghost. The distant hum from the valley is a constant reminder. The forgotten footpath didn't end with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless growth of a forest, and the receding echo of hobnailed boots on stone, replaced by the whistle of a steam engine and the indifferent sigh of the wind through new trees. The ghost of the path persists, a tenacious phantom beneath the green shroud. You're not the only one seeking it. Ahead, you see a flash of bright synthetic fabric, a modern hiking jacket. You've caught up to a small group, their faces maps of concentration as they consult a GPS device and a faded, hand-drawn sketch. They are pathfinders, historians, and volunteers from an organization like Viastoria, engaged in the slow, meticulous work of rediscovery. You are no longer walking a forgotten path, you are witnessing its archaeology in real time. This is the work of memory, performed not with shovels, but with footsteps, brushes, and stubborn curiosity. The widely accepted historical fact is that a movement to preserve and re-sign these historic transit routes began in the late 20th century, part of a broader European awakening to cultural landscape heritage. These weren't to be turned into paved highways, but rather saved as cultural monuments in their own right, the Wedgedenkmäler, path monuments. The work is detective-like. It starts in archives, with old tax records, property maps, and travel diaries that mention a path to the upper spring or the goat track to the jock. Then, the team takes those clues to the field, fighting through the undergrowth to find the physical evidence. The packed earth, the retaining walls, the cairns now tumbled into mere stone piles. It is a process of reknitting the landscape's memory. Joining the group, you see the tools of this trade, not just GPS, but simple tape measures, brushes to clear soil from cut stones, and red and white plastic ribbons to mark the hypothesized route. The leader, a woman with hands as weathered as the old Seine, points to a barely perceptible terrace in the hillside. "See here," she says, "the path didn't go straight up. It switched back. That's the herder's logic. Preserve the animal's energy." To the untrained eye, it's a slope. To her, it's a sentence in the mountain's diary, and she has just deciphered the grammar. Each rediscovered meter is a victory. They are not making a new trail, they are listening for an old one's whisper and then giving it a voice again with fresh paint blazes on the rocks. Here's the delightful, human detail about this work. Often, the best sources aren't documents, but the memories of the oldest locals. A researcher might sit with a 90-year-old former herder, now in a valley nursing home, and show him aerial photographs. The old man's finger, trembling with age but sure in its knowledge, will trace a line across the screen that no satellite can see. "Here," he'll say, "we went here because the rock was dry after rain. And here, we had to cross the stream because on the other side, the farmer from the next valley would shout if our cows ate his grass." This is oral history as forensic cartography. These living memories are the final, fading link to the path's original purpose. When that generation passes, the path's why, its social and economic logic, dies with them, leaving only its physical shell. The volunteers are racing not just against vegetation, but against time itself. But what is the goal? To create a museum piece, or a living trail? Historians and trail advocates still argue whether these rediscovered paths should be restored to their original state, a brutal, practical track, or adapted for modern recreational hiking, with safety cables on the exposed sections and gentle grades cut into the steepest parts. Is the authenticity in the historical challenge, or in making the history accessible? The debate plays out in every reconstructed section. Do you clear the young pines that have grown over the path, or are those trees now part of the landscape's history too? There's no easy answer. Each choice is a negotiation between the past's truth and the present's reality. The path is being remembered, but it cannot be resurrected unchanged. It must be translated for a new era. You help the group clear a fallen branch from a beautifully crafted dry stone wall, its symmetry revealed after decades of obscurity. The act feels like communion. You are not just learning about the path. You are, in a small way, participating in its continuity. The forgotten footpath is finding a new purpose, no longer as a conduit for cheese and cattle, but as a conduit for memory and meaning. The modern pilgrims walking it now seek not pasture, but perspective. They carry digital cameras instead of salt sacks, but the mountain under their feet is the same, and the act of attentive travel, of following a line laid down by necessity, still has the power to connect. The path is dead as an economic entity. Long live the path as a story. You leave the volunteers behind, their red ribbons fluttering like modern-day prayer flags marking the resurrection. The path, now clearer, leads you across a high alpine meadow dotted with wildflowers. It's idyllic, but your mind is elsewhere, nagged by a growing realization. You've seen the stones, the huts, the grooves in the rock. You've followed the physical evidence. But with every step, you sense the presence of something more intangible that once flowed along this route, something that didn't fossilize. You've been walking the skeleton of the past, but where is its nervous system? The answer is, it evaporated. You are now contemplating the ghost in the machine, the vast body of unwritten, practical knowledge that died when the paths fell silent. The widely accepted historical fact is that pre-industrial societies operated on a foundation of tacit knowledge, skills and understanding learned through imitation, practice, and lived experience, not through manuals or schools. On these paths, this knowledge was the true currency of survival. It was the herder's ability to diagnose a cow's illness by the gloss of its coat or the set of its ears. It was the sawmer's skill in loading a mule so the weight sat perfectly, not rubbing a sore for the next 8 hours of climbing. It was knowing which alpine plant would staunch a bleeding wound, which cloud formation promised a storm in 2 hours, and which wind would bring the warm fond to melt the snow on a south-facing pass a day early. This was the operating system for life at altitude, and it was stored not in books, but in bodies and in the shared, collective memory of the community that used the paths. Walking alone now, you try to guess some of it. You see a patch of oddly colored grass. Was that a sign of a mineral lick, a place herds would naturally congregate? You hear a shift in the wind's pitch as it funnels through a cleft. Was that a warning to a herder that bad weather was channeling into this particular valley? You have no idea. You are functionally illiterate in the language of this place. The path is a text, but the deeper meaning of its landmarks, the grammar of survival, is largely lost. The modern hiker's knowledge is compartmentalized, a weather app, a first aid kit, a GPS. The herder's knowledge was holistic, woven into the very fabric of his daily movement. It was place-specific, earned through a lifetime of mistakes and observations on this exact terrain. Here's the poignant, almost cruel detail of this loss. Much of this knowledge was actively discarded by the modernizing world. When veterinary science arrived, the old herbal remedies were dismissed as superstition. When official meteorology began, the weather lore of the herdsman was considered quaint folklore. When topographic maps were printed, the oral narratives of the path were obsolete. The children of the last Zen went to school in the valley, learned standardized information, and got jobs on the railway or in factories. They had no need to know how to coax a nervous cow across a scree slope, or how to smell an incoming blizzard on the air. The knowledge wasn't stolen, it was rendered irrelevant, and like an unused muscle, it atrophied. The final bearer of 1,000 subtle skills often took them to his grave because no one asked, and no one needed to know. This leads to a quiet, profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this loss of tacit knowledge represents a net gain or loss for human adaptability. The modern world offers incredible safety and predictability. No one here is arguing for a return to dying of a preventable hoof infection. But did we also lose a way of thinking, a deep, relational intelligence about specific environments? The Haider's knowledge was not just a list of facts. It was a dynamic, responsive dialogue with a specific mountain. It fostered a kind of humility and attention that a generic, app-based existence might not. Can we quantify the value of knowing a place so intimately that you can navigate it blind, in a storm, because your body remembers the sequence of turns? The path is the proof that such knowledge existed, and its silence is the proof that it is gone. You stop at a spring, one that would have been a crucial waypoint. You drink, the water achingly cold and pure. A Haider would have known if this spring ran year-round, or if it was a seasonal trickle. He would have known if the water here gave the cows diarrhea, and thus was only for human use. He would have known to check for the tracks of chamois or deer here, a sign of the water's safety. You just see water. The path has brought you to the resource, but the deep biography of the resource is missing. You are experiencing the landscape as a panorama, not as a conversation. The forgotten footpaths are more than just trails. They are the faded circuits of a lost intelligence, and walking them now is an act of poignant, partial recollection, hearing the echo of a vast, silent wisdom in the wind. The path makes one final, long-busting ascent, pushing above the tree line to the very spine of the range. You are on a jog, a high pass that feels like the roof of the world. This is no gentle saddle, it's a razor of rock and wind-scoured ice. Here, the path isn't forgotten, it's elemental. It's the only possible line. To your left, the land falls away into the catchment of the Rhône, its waters destined for the Mediterranean. To your right, the slope feeds the Rhine, beginning its long journey to the North Sea. You are standing on a continental watershed, and for a moment, the enormity of the web you've been tracing crystallizes. You see not just a single path, but the idea of the path. You understand, finally, why these forgotten threads still matter, not as nostalgia, but as a vital imprint on everything that followed. The widely accepted historical fact is that geography is destiny. These paths, by dictating where and how people moved, directly shaped Alpine culture, settlement patterns, law, and even genetics. The isolated communities connected by these trails developed distinct dialects, cheese recipes, and legal traditions. The famous Landesgemeinde or open-air assemblies where communities governed themselves. The paths facilitated the exchange that prevented total isolation, but the difficulty of the travel ensured that each valley retained its fierce independence. This tension, connection versus insularity, forged the unique political and cultural mosaic of Switzerland itself. The path beneath your feet is a root filament of a nation's character, a line that helped draw the map of a people who defined themselves by valleys and passes, not by kings. Look down from this godlike vantage. You can see the modern world clearly, the highway serpentines, the railway tunnels, the glittering resort towns. But you can also see, like a faint watermark on the landscape, the ghost of the old network. The modern hiking trail often follows the Somweg. The ski lift climbs a slope that was once a summer pasture reached by a herder's track. The chic restaurant in Zermatt serves an authentic Alpine cheese that is a commercialized echo of the Sens craft. The path's physical form may be crumbling, but its influence has metastasized into the very identity and economy of the region. Tourism, Switzerland's biggest industry, sells a romanticized version of the world these paths sustained. You are, in a sense, standing at the source code of a global brand, the Swiss Alps. But here's the critical, less romantic detail. The paths also shape the ecology you're admiring. This isn't a pristine wilderness, it's a crafted landscape. For centuries, the movement of herds maintained these high meadows. The grazing prevented forest encroachment, creating the iconic, open, flower-strewn slopes that define the Alpine aesthetic in every brochure. The biodiversity of these meadows, butterflies, ground-nesting birds, rare flowers, is a direct byproduct of the pastoral economy that the paths served. Now, as the paths fade and dairying becomes less viable, the forest is advancing. What we think of as untouched nature is actually a historical artifact of human labor, a masterpiece of unintentional environmental engineering sustained by footsteps and hooves. The path is a key to the garden, and we're in danger of misplacing it. This brings us to the final, living debate. Historians, ecologists, and planners still argue whether the future of the Alps lies in embracing hypermodernity, more tunnels, more efficient commercial farming, year-round tourism, or in a form of managed renaissance for these traditional practices and paths. Is there a way to reintegrate the old network, not as a museum, but as a functional part of a sustainable, localized economy? Could revived transhumance, supported by niche markets for its products, help maintain the biodiversity these paths created? The path is now a question. What do we want this landscape to be? A playground, a factory, a preserve, or a living, evolving culture that remembers its own feet? The answer isn't clear, but the path forces us to ask it. The wind screams across the pass, pulling tears from your eyes. You take a last look along the line you've traveled, now visible as a faint, poetic scar across the shoulders of mountains. It is a record of need, a monument to adaptation, and a warning. It reminds us that our fastest routes often bypass the terrain that shapes us, that efficiency can erase intelligence, and that connection, when it becomes too easy, can dilute the very distinctiveness it seeks to reach. The forgotten footpath is a whisper from a time when human life was scaled to the rhythm of a walk, the growth of grass, and the turning of seasons. In our frenetic century, that whisper, carried on this thin, cold air at the top of the world, is perhaps the most important thing it has left to deliver. The descent from the pass is not a journey into a new valley, but a gradual return. The razor edge of the continental divide softens into a wide, U-shaped glacial trough. The path here is clear, almost polite, as if acknowledging that its hardest work is behind it. The light is softening too, the sharp alpine blue melting into the golden, sideways glow of late afternoon. Your footsteps, which have been a study in effort and attention for what feels like both an instant and an eternity, begin to find a slower, more rhythmic cadence. The urgency of discovery fades, replaced by a gentle process of synthesis. You are no longer following a path, you are carrying it within you, a new, quiet layer beneath your own skin. You pass the tumbled remains of a final cane, its stones scattered by frost heave or perhaps a careless boot. You don't stop to rebuild it. Its time as a critical marker is done, and there is a peace in letting it be a ruin, a testament to a function fulfilled. The wind, once a violent sculptor on the heights, is now just a breeze, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth from the forest below. The sounds of the modern world, which you glimpsed from the pass as an abstract hum, are still absent here. In this space between the high drama of the peaks and the busyness of the valley floor, there is a profound silence, broken only by your own breath and the distant, eternal trickle of meltwater. It is the silence of a story that has been told, its final echoes settling into the landscape. You think of the herder, the sormer, the missionary, the guide. Their ghosts have walked with you, not as spooky specters, but as echoes of specific, grounded intentions, to feed, to trade, to comfort, to lead. Their world was one of relentless immediacy, where a slipped load or a misread cloud was a crisis. Your journey, by contrast, has been one of leisure and curiosity, a privilege they would have found utterly baffling. Yet, for a few hours, your feet traced their intentions, and in that tracing, a bridge was built across the chasm of time. You haven't lived their life, but you have, in some small way, honored its physical reality. The path was the medium for that connection, a line drawn by need that now serves as a line for memory. The trees appear again, first as stunted, wind-bent sentinels, then as a true forest. The path becomes a soft aisle of needles between their trunks. The temperature rises slightly, the air growing richer with the smell of life and decay. You are leaving the realm of rock and sky for the realm of soil and root. It feels like a gentle exhalation. The immense, demanding openness of the high places is giving way to an embrace. Your muscles ache, but it's a clean, honest ache, the kind that promises deep sleep and the memory of effort well spent. The thousands of steps, the scrambles, the moments of doubt and clarity, are now blending into a single, seamless sensation of having traveled. You see a final landmark ahead, a wooden signpost, freshly painted, at a junction. One arrow points back the way you came, labeled with the name of the pass and its altitude in crisp, white lettering. The other points down, toward the name of a village you recognize. This is where the forgotten footpath officially ends, absorbed into the modern, waymarked hiking network. You pause at the junction, a point of translation between two worlds. You don't feel a sense of loss, but rather of completion. The path has delivered you, as it delivered countless others, to a threshold. Your journey on its specific, historic terms is over. But the journey it sparked, the contemplation of a hidden world, the feel of history in your legs, that will continue to unfold in your mind long after your boots are off. You take the path downward, toward the village lights now twinkling like oath-bound stars in the gathering dusk. The walking is easy now, almost effortless, as if the mountain, satisfied with your respect, is gently nudging you home. The stories settle within you, the taste of the cheese, the chill of the gorge, the clatter of phantom hooves, the stubborn courage in the face of rock and weather. They are not burdens, but quiet companions. You understand now that these paths were never truly forgotten. They were just waiting, patient as stone, for someone to choose to listen with their feet, to read the landscape with a humble heart, and to remember that before there were lines on a map, there were footsteps on the earth, seeking a way, creating a home, one slow, deliberate, forgotten step at a time. The village is quiet, wrapped in the deep blue blanket of an Alpine evening. A single church bell tolls the hour, its sound clear and rounded, rolling up the slopes you've just descended. It doesn't feel like an ending, but a gentle full stop. You find a spot on a low wall, your body grateful for the stillness. The monumental scale of the peaks is now a soft, jagged silhouette against a star-dusted violet sky. The wind has stilled completely. All the grand narratives of economy, war, culture, loss that played out on those heights now condense into a single, simple feeling of presence. You are here, at the end of a line drawn by others, and the connection hums, a low, warm frequency beneath the fatigue. There is no need to draw more lessons, to extract more meaning. The meaning is in the soreness of your calves, the coolness of the air on your face, the profound quiet that now feels rich and full rather than empty. The forgotten footpaths have done their final, most important work. They have pulled you out of the stream of ordinary time and placed you, for a while, into a different kind of time, geological, historical, seasonal. And now they release you back, gently. The memories will soften, the specific details will blur, but the impression, the shape of the journey, will remain like a fossil in your mind, a personal geology. So you sit, and you breathe, and you listen to the nothing and the everything. The mountains are done telling their story for tonight. They withdraw into their ancient, silent watch. The last light fades from the highest snowfield. The journey is complete. The path is behind you. The rest is stillness, and the sweet, enveloping peace of a world that continues, patient and immense, beyond the reach of our bustling hours, cradling its forgotten footsteps and its remembered skies, forever.